In DC, for DC. DC Radio, 96.3 HD4 and DCRadio.gov.
Thank you, deep voiced person with a funky backbeat. Indeed, this is not a council hearing, this is hearing the council. You can't have a government without a council, so you can't have a government radio station without a council show. This is it. We're not coming to you from the train track enclosed nerve center like we normally do. We're coming to you from my home and the chairman's. That's weird. I'm Josh Gibson, Director of Communications for the Council. You may also know me as the Council's voice on social media at Council of DC. Listeners, this is a special round of hearing the council interviews, one we never expected to have to do and hope we'll never have to repeat in the future. This is a special COVID edition of Hearing the Council. Thank you for joining us, Chairman Mendelson.
Thank you for having us, Mr. Gibson.
I know that you are very tight on time, so we're going to attempt to go as quickly as we can and let you go as early as we can. How would you sum up the council's response to COVID? What was your strategy and your approach?
What we've tried to do is, first of all, be as consensus-driven as possible. And that's not only consensus within the council, which we've been so far, but also consensus in working with the mayor and on a few issues with the Attorney General. Second of all, the council doesn't play the same kind of role in an emergency, like this public health emergency, that we would do in ordinary times. I think it's very important that we work as closely with the mayor and be supportive, recognizing that so much of dealing with the emergency and the public health issues is executive driven. In other words, they're not legislative solutions to the crisis. However, having just said that, the third thing that we have done is to look for ways that legislatively we can reduce barriers or reduce burdens or assist with individuals or with businesses. What are barriers to helping? So early on, meaning March 17th, at the beginning of the emergency, the council adopted comprehensive legislation with unemployment, changes to unemployment insurance so that individuals could easily access the insurance, and with eviction prohibition so that people didn't need to worry about being evicted in the middle of their having lost their job because of the virus. And we looked at what issues were a problem and that we could deal with and acted legislatively. And we've continued to do that since then. Fine-tuning the eviction provisions, for example, dealing with debt collection, deferral of rent or utility payments. All of these are issues where the law needed to be changed in order to provide consumer protection or to help with businesses, or just to make sure that the mayor has clear authority.
And almost every 2 weeks since then, the council has passed some sort of COVID-oriented omnibus measure.
Correct.
My understanding is at tomorrow's meeting, there's going to be an omnibus of the omnibi, capturing the progress of all the past bills in a single bill. Can you explain how and why that's happening?
I can, and it will be monumentally uninteresting. So what's that?
Then we can pass. If it doesn't interest you, it won't interest the others.
No, it interests me.
Oh, okay. Well, would you like to take a stab at it, or should we just go to the next question?
The council has adopted 4 emergencies. An emergency bill is one that can be effective as soon as the mayor signs it, but it only lasts for 90 days, as opposed to typical legislation, which requires 2 votes of the council, signature by the mayor, then goes up to Congress for at least a 30-day layover. We've passed 4 emergency bills, and some of them are amending each other. So they've begun to sort of tumble over each other, and they have an effective date that's retroactive to March 11th, which made sense back in March 17th, and it still makes sense. But if the bill's only good for 90 days and it's retroactive to March 11th, these bills are going to be expiring in a matter of weeks. So we're putting them all together. reorganizing them so that all the provisions dealing with rent are in one place as opposed to a section of one bill and a section of another bill. We're also looking at the language more carefully to make sure that ambiguities are clarified and some problems that have come forward that have been brought to our attention or dealt with. There may be, I'm going to say maybe a half dozen new sections. For instance, utility payment plans is a new section that we hadn't previously adopted. But most of the 250-page bill is just a reorganization, consolidation of the 4 previous emergencies. The emergency that we'll be considering will be retroactive to March 11th, but we will simultaneously adopt a second emergency that's virtually identical that will be effective beginning in June. So in that way, we're taking care of the time lapse. Was
Okay.
it fascinating?
Yeah, super fascinating. Should the public expect, and sort of on an ongoing basis, that there be an omnibus measure every couple of weeks or so, or do you feel like kind of like we're flattening the legislative curve, we're getting ahead of a lot of the issues that could come up, so they should see a diminishing number of council special actions?
Well, sometimes legislators feel that they need to be doing something, and so really all we can do is either oversight hearings or legislation. I'm hopeful that the urge to legislate will be dying down. It hasn't really, but I'm hopeful that it's going to be dying down, because we've now been at this for almost 2 months. And other than some ideas issues that we never envisioned, there really shouldn't be much new. An example of something we hadn't envisioned was that we shut down the restaurants as part of this emergency, the social distancing. We immediately knew that there would be an issue with, they have no income. So we allow carry out and delivery. And didn't occur to us that delivery could occur one of 2 ways. So Josh, you could call the restaurant and say, I want to get a hamburger to go, and you go pick it up. Or you could go through an app and order your hamburger, which will be delivered to you. And the latter sounds pretty simple, but what you don't know as a consumer is that there is a delivery charge. It's just not charged to you. It's taken as a commission against the restaurant. And there have been commissions as high as 30%, which basically wipes out any meager profit the restaurant is getting. So 2 weeks ago, we adopted legislation and, among other things, capped how much that commission could be. We capped it at 15%. We had never imagined that would be an issue back in March. It became apparent that it was a problem, and so we've dealt with it. And so there'll probably be a few more things like that, but I'm hopeful that the legislative itch have been scratched enough over the last 2 months that there won't be a lot of new stuff going forward.
Well, but following on that, just as perhaps the COVID legislative cycle is winding down, the budgetary cycle is winding up. And we know from the CFO that the council needs to take roughly 700 million out of the ongoing fiscal year budget, with only 6 months to go, 5.5 months to go, and another 750 out of next year's budget. So basically, we're passing 2 of the most difficult budgets the council's passed in decades in an abbreviated time frame. What are your thoughts on that?
Recessions are different. That's my first thought. And instead of our arguing over what to do with the growing largesse, instead we now have to tighten our belts and figure out where to do the painful process of cutting. I spoke with the city administrator the other day who indicated that the mayor's proposed budget will be taking something like 450 cuts across the 8 different agencies. And so I think we should be expecting that this will be painful. I don't want to exaggerate that. I think that the city has benefited from enormous growth in revenues, and so it's put us in a very strong position. And so if we are, if we're thoughtful enough about how to balance things, I think we can get cuts, even though $750 million sounds like a lot. We can get cuts without doing real damage to any of the important programs that we have. But that takes some work. Remember, I say remember as if I'd already said this. If I remember correctly, the revenue estimates indicated a 7% drop in revenues. 7% is hefty, but it's not as much as what a lot of jurisdictions are facing, which is double digit, maybe 20, 30%. So.
Will it be harder to get the money out of the ongoing FY20 budget, the $700 million, or will it be harder to get it out of next year's?
Well, we'll see what the mayor proposes. And then we'll either agree or disagree. For closing the fiscal year 2020, the current year gap, we can use one-time fixes. When I say one-time fixes, just as an example, we could cancel a capital project. If it's what we call pay-go money, which is cash as opposed to borrowing, we could just transfer that to operating. It doesn't work as a long-term strategy. Most of our expenses are recurring as opposed to one-time. For instance, a payroll expense. Unless DPW is going to get rid of all of its sanitation workers, and I know it's not, but unless it's going to get rid of its sanitation workers, their salaries are recurring. It's year after year after year. So you can't use one-time funding to pay for something like that. But closing a deficit in 2020, the current year, we can use one-time money. And that makes the options for the solution easier.
Will this be the hardest budget cycle since you joined the council?
No.
What?
No. We had a recession, the Great Recession in 2008. And there also was a very brief revenue shortfall back after 9/11. And I'm trying to remember in the 90s, the late 90s, the control board, I don't think there was the cutting. In the early 90s, there were deficits every year. Now, I wasn't a council member, but I was here as staff. And I remember the pain of going through those cuts. So I've seen it.
What made those harder?
The district was not in as strong a position financially. And so it didn't have as many tools available to help resolve the gaps. Plus, there were, I think this is a variant of what I just said about fiscally strong. The government and its budget structure was unsound. And so it wasn't just fixing a problem because there was a greater problem surrounding it, and we weren't able to deal with that. For instance, we had an unfunded pension liability of, if I remember correctly, several $1 billion. We had expenses then that we don't have now. And in the early 90s, the government was solving a lot of its budget problems with gimmicks. Some people may remember the infamous fifth quarter, that one year the budget was balanced by moving up tax payments by a quarter, so there were 5 quarters of payments in 1 year. That stuff is, if I say goofy, that's almost making light of it. It had real consequences, namely that the short-term solution didn't solve anything and maybe even made the the midterm solution or midterm situation worse. So that was the context back then.
Once sports and restaurants and bars come back, I would love to open a sports bar across from the Wilson Building called the Fifth Quarter.
Okay, do it.
Maybe in our post-government lives, we could go in on that together.
Well, I could, I was going to say I could partner with you, but I have to be careful about outside employment.
Yes. Do you, I think I misspoke earlier and said it was a shortened budget cycle, and we really can't shorten the budget cycle by law because the Home Rule Act states, 54 and 70 days, or am I misspeaking?
Well, we can shorten it because I believe the law, it gives us up to 56 days before the first vote, 70 days before the second vote. But the fact is that 56 days is very short. That means that the committees of the council have basically a month to examine $8 billion worth of local spending, or I think it's closer to $15 billion total, including federal money.
To what, 2 or 3 questions in my head. One is, do you think this abbreviated cycle, these 2 big budgets with heavy cuts, do you think that process-wise plays to the mayor or the council? And a parallel question is, I know like you said, the omnibus measures have been from a consensus standpoint. To what extent do you think this will be able to be a consensus budget?
I think all of our budgets have gone through on a unanimous vote, and
But I mean consensus, executive, legislative.
I'm hopeful that this budget will be more consensus oriented between the mayor and the council than previous budgets have been. The mayor has strongly objected to some changes we've made in the past, but I don't know that we're going to be doing that much of it. I think that much of that, what we've done in the past, because we're in cutback mode.
Is there, the mayor has said, I believe, that nothing is off the table in terms of the budget. Is there anything from a council perspective that you see as being off the table in terms of subject to cuts?
I think if we're speaking in generalities, I would say there's nothing off the table. But I know when the mayor said that, she made a point of that at the press conference where the revenue estimates were released, and it made a lot of people nervous. The media picked it up like, oh, there could be furloughs, there could be RIFs. Yeah, there could be. I think it's unlikely. I think we handicap ourselves if we start picking things to put off the table. If we take something off the table, then somebody's going to come along and say, you got to take something else off the table. And I don't know that that's a good place for our energies because some things are not likely. And I think that the furloughs and risks are unlikely.
Okay, changing topics a bit. How are you experiencing this from a constituent service standpoint, with your constituent service as opposed to your legislative aspect of being a council member? What are you hearing from people? What is shocking you? What is saddening you? What is heartening you?
Well, when you ask it that way, I feel like there's something that was on my mind earlier that was either shocking or disheartening. At the moment, though, I can't remember that. We are trying to continue with constituent services. It's a little bit more difficult to do it remotely. In my office, my constituent services team likes to go out and do field visits, see what's actually going on, and they're not able to do as much of that. So,
I mean, for constituent, what are you hearing? What are the COVID impacts that you're hearing from people, and how are they? What are the emotions that you're hearing in your interactions?
I would say I'm not hearing that much. I'm hearing a lot of from advocacy groups concerns about what could be, like that childcare centers could be won't be able to sustain the shutdown, and they'll be going out of business. And we've been looking at that and seeing if there's something we can do to help. But my point is that most of what I've been hearing has been advocates who are concerned about the need for some policy, or that some other policy is actually getting in the way and hurting people, as opposed to hearing from individuals a different kind of a comment or complaint.
Yeah, that to me, it was the first few weeks were the most intense when we were getting a lot of feedback via social media about people, the direct impact on people. So I would kind of second that. And then how are you dealing with this personally? The idea of quarantine and most people not being at the office and not being able to go to restaurants or the theater or those kinds of things.
Let's see, you threw out a few things. First of all, I don't think anybody who worked in the Wilson building has been quarantined.
No, I don't mean quarantine. I mean being,
Stayed at home. Yeah. I think people are getting used to it. I mean, we're doing this Facebook, but we're getting used to doing this. It's different, but we're figuring it out. Although I do think that there is a lot of longing for getting that social interaction, which actually makes the day more interesting and then oftentimes in dealing with issues more helpful. It would be nicer to do this interview, Josh, person to person rather than electronically where you're just a little box. But it's working. The not going to restaurants is probably a good thing, although I probably shouldn't say that, because we need to support our restaurants and local businesses. Cooking more at home, learning a few recipes that are kind of tasty, a couple of disasters there. I had the experience of having my house chalk bombed the other day. People showed up and wrote all over the sidewalk political messages. That was new and different. They were all wearing masks as far as I could tell. I wasn't there. Neighbor sent me pictures. I think that these remote conferences and meetings, in some ways, they illustrate that we can have meetings without everybody having to get dressed and pack up their briefcases and come down to the Wilson building and wait for the meeting. There's another way to do it. But at the same time, I think we're getting more used to these Zoom platform meetings, and they're taking up more and more of a day. So it's just a change of life. Interesting, but interesting getting used to it, but it is different.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then while you're answering, I'm going to quickly check on Facebook and see if there's any questions that have come in from constituents. One of the few, to me, downsides, I think the online meetings, it's a fairly successful platform, but public interaction and input seems to be a bit of a challenge and a struggle related to the budget process, for one. What do you think, how do you think the level of public input is going to be, and do you think there are ways to improve it? Do you think it's satisfactory, and do you think there are ways to improve it?
The council in developing the schedule for the budget has gone out of its way to figure out how to ensure public participation. I had urged every committee to have at least one hearing with the public. In some ways, it might be a good thing that the hearings are more streamlined, because I think it's really hard on the public when there's a 9-hour hearing and they don't know whether to come to the chamber at 6 o'clock in the afternoon or wait until 9 o'clock in the afternoon, or evening, I should say. Every committee has a phone line where people can call and speak their testimony, which will be transcribed and then entered into the record. So that's a new feature that makes it easier for the public to participate. But our hearings will be shorter, and so they'll be fewer public witnesses at our hearings, but we're encouraging people to submit written testimony as well. So there are opportunities for public participation. They're not the same as long and longer as in the past, but there will be opportunities.
Gotcha. On Facebook, there just seem to be comments, editorial, positive and negative, but no questions. And I know that you're very tight on time. Are there any final comments or anything you'd like to say to constituents or funny stories? What one of your cooking disasters was?
I burned something. I burned the applesauce. I burned the cabbage. I might have burned the spaghetti sauce. What's that?
Was through distraction or ineptitude? Because I could see you being distracted and trying to balance the budget in your head, and then, or was it just poor service?
Well, I like to think that I'm a Renaissance man, that I can cook and think about the budget, as well as be on the phone, as well as take care of the cats at the same time. But maybe I need to reflect and work on that.
Understood. Well, I wanted to be good to my promise to let you off in time for your next call. Let me just read the closeout, and then we're good to go.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Okay. New listeners, you can subscribe to this podcast on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for joining us. Tune in again next time. We're at DC Radio at 96.3 on your HD4 dial or at dcradio.gov. I'm Josh Gibson, and this is not a council hearing. This is Hearing the Council. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
In DC, for DC, DC Radio, 96.3 HD4 and dcradio.gov.